The void around the Clyros rift was silent, but not peaceful. It was the silence of dead ships, drifting wreckage and cold metal cooling after battle. The Allied fleet hung there like wounded animals, their formation broken, hulls torn apart. By the enemy's relentless assault, engines flickered weakly, barely keeping the ships alive. Inside the flag carrier Vigilant Dawn, Admiral Sarek stood on the bridge with his hands clenched behind his back, his eyes locked on the holographic battle map. Red enemy markers surrounded them on three sides, closing in with the slow, steady patience of predators. Every time he looked at the timer above the map, the numbers reminded him reinforcements were 20 minutes too late. His comms officer's voice broke the tense air. "Admiral." Another cruiser just went dark. She swallowed hard, listening. To her earpiece, they didn't have time to send a final transmission. Sarek's jaw tightened. That was the fourth ship in less than an hour. "Send another call. All frequencies. All channels. I don't care if they hear us." His voice was low, but there was steel in it. "Tell them we won't last much longer." Across the fractured battlefield, alien captains on battered ships listened to the same desperate orders. The fleet's survival depended on reinforcement ships from their home worlds, their allies, their long-standing packs. But the hours had stretched into days, and no help had come. The enemy, an empire of cold-blooded conquerors called the Vraks, had been hunting them without mercy. Their ships were sleek, black, and fast, cutting through space like blades. The Vraks weren't here for territory. They were here to wipe out every single ship, to erase the fleet from history. The channel crackled to life, static filling the bridge as Sarek's message went out into the endless dark. "To any Allied command, this is Admiral Sarek of the Allied Defense Fleet. We are pinned at Clyros Rift. Our shields are down. Ammunition reserves are near empty, and enemy forces are preparing a final strike. If reinforcements do not arrive," he paused, glancing at the terrified crew around him. "We will not survive the next hour," the message repeated, looping again and again across the comm grid. But the only reply was silence. Minutes crawled by. The enemy ships tightened their circle. On the Vigilant Dawn, the hum of the life support systems seemed louder than the voices of the crew. Officers worked their stations with stiff, mechanical motions, as if keeping their hands busy could push back the fear creeping into their chests. Sarek forced himself to keep breathing evenly. In every war, there were moments where the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. He had seen it before, but never like this. Then, a faint tone cut through the bridge's sensor alert. The tactical officer leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at her display. "Admiral, I'm picking up new warp signatures. Multiple, unknown configuration. Unknown." Sarek's brow furrowed. "Are they ours?" She shook her head slowly. "Negative. Sir, not in any database. They're different." On the holographic display, ghostly blue shapes appeared at the far edge of the rift. They didn't match any known Allied or enemy design. Their engines burned hotter, their signatures unstable, almost violent. More appeared. Dozens, then hundreds. Whispers spread across the bridge. No one wanted to say it out loud, but every veteran here knew the stories, the ones that spoke of a species from a hostile, it's almost unlivable world, a place so dangerous that surviving it forged creatures that could outfight almost anyone in the galaxy. They were called Deathworlders, and there was only one Deathworld anyone knew of. Humans.
Ow.
Someone whispered. The word carried through the bridge like a shadow. Sarek stared at the display. The ships were big not the elegant curves of Allied cruisers, nor the dagger shapes of the Vraks. These were blunt, scarred behemoths, covered in thick armor plates. Their hulls bore scorch marks from battles long past. Their weapons arrays bristled like claws. And yet they did not slow to form up alongside the Allied fleet. Instead, they broke formation and streaked forward, directly toward the enemy lines. "What are they doing?" the tactical officer muttered. They're not here to reinforce us." Sarek said nothing. He could feel the tension winding tighter in his chest. The human fleet didn't answer hails. Row. They didn't even acknowledge the Allied fleet's existence. They moved with the cold precision of predators who had found their prey. On the enemy side, the Vraks hesitated. For the first time in this battle, their formation shifted, their lines fracturing as they adjusted their positions. Clearly, they knew the Death Worlders too. Clearly, they remembered. The humans closed the gap in silence. No warnings, no speeches, no announcements of peace or war. Just the distant shimmer of their drive flares as they burn toward the enemy. At impossible speed, Admiral, the comms officer said, her voice almost trembling. Should we hail them again? Sarek's eyes stayed locked on the display. The humans were already in attack range. No, he said quietly. We watch. In the far black, the first human ship opened fire. The first human salvo cut across the darkness like a streak of burning silver. No one on the Allied side had seen weapons fire like a trail gone round, so fast they blurred into light, each one carrying enough force to shatter a cruiser's spine. The Vraks formation jerked, ships breaking off as impacts ripped through their outer line. Explosions blossomed in silence, debris flashing in the starlight before vanishing into the void. But the humans did not slow. Their ships drove forward, with relentless momentum, ignoring the safer distances other fleets kept. From the bridge of the vigilant dawn, Admiral Sarek watched, his crew transfixed by the display. He had seen veteran commanders send waves of fighters, coordinate precision strikes, rely on decades of doctrine. The humans seemed to follow none of it. Their fleet didn't split into wings, didn't wait for shields to drop before firing. They moved like a storm, messy, unpredictable, unstoppable. Multiple hull breaches detected on enemy ships, the tactical officer reported. Her voice was steady, but Sarek could see the flicker in her eyes. Admiral, they're not targeting command ships. They're hitting anything in their path. On the enemy side, Vraks commanders scrambled to adapt. Alien warships were fast and agile, built for long-range precision strikes. They weren't built to handle this kind of assault up close, punishing, almost suicidal. Yet the humans didn't seem concerned about their own safety. As they closed the distance, their weapons shifted. Missiles flared from launch bays, but instead of heading straight for enemy vessels, they detonated in empty space. Sarek frowned. That wasn't a miss, it was deliberate. Seconds later, his sensors picked it up. The sensor officer's voice was tight. They're creating debris. Hundreds of fragments. No thousands. The debris wasn't random. Humans were breaking apart wrecks, abandoned fighter hulls, even asteroid fragments from the rift itself, turning them into kinetic shrapnel fields. Enemy ships swerved to avoid them, but in doing so, they fell out of formation, exposing their flanks. And then the humans struck again. A second railgun volley ripped through the chaos, smashing crippled ships. Before they could recover, Sarek felt a chill. This wasn't standard military strategy. It was a hunter's trap. Forcing prey into panic, then striking the instant they exposed themselves. On the enemy flagship, the Vraks commander bared his fangs in what passed for a smile among his kind. His fleet outnumbered the humans 3-1. He barked orders, sending his fastest ships to flank the newcomers, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm them. The humans didn't change course. They didn't even adjust formation. Then Sarek saw why. The flanking Vraks ships accelerated straight into another debris cloud, except this one wasn't random rock. The fragments ignited, revealing themselves as autonomous drones. Tiny compared to a warship, but armed with cutting lasers and explosive charges. They swarmed over the Vraks ships like insects, carving into armor, disabling engines, tearing sensor arrays apart. The Allied bridge went silent, watching the slaughter. One of Sarek's junior officers broke the stillness. Sir, they're not here to help us. Sarek didn't look away from the display. No, he said quietly. They're here to destroy them. The human fleet plunged deeper into enemy space, breaking the Vraks line into pieces. Notice something else every time the Vraks tried to regroup. The humans ignored the closer, easier kills and instead targeted the ships giving orders. It was systematic. It was precise. "Admiral," the comms officer said, "I still can't raise them. All channels blocked on their side. They're shutting out everything." Sarek understood now. This wasn't a rescue mission. The humans hadn't come to protect the Allied fleet. They were running their own operation. One they didn't want interrupted by politics or questions. The VHX finally rallied to counterattack dozens of ships, breaking through the chaos to converge on the largest human battleship. They hit it with everything: plasma torpedoes, disruptor beams, mass drivers. The void lit up with fire. For a heartbeat, Sarek thought the Death Worlder ship might actually fall. But when the light faded, the massive vessel was still moving forward. Its armor was scorched, its hull pitted with craters, but its guns were still firing. Not one shot slowed. Then it happened. The humans did something Sarek hadn't seen in decades of command. They rammed a human destroyer half the size of Ceres. Its target drove straight into a Vrax heavy cruiser at full burn. The impact tore both ships apart in a brilliant flash, debris scattering in all directions. In the middle of that chaos, the rest of the human fleet surged forward. Using the explosion as cover, the Vrax began to break. Sarek saw it in the way their formation crumbled, their fire patterns faltered. Fear had entered the fight, and the Death Worlders were feeding it, sir, the tactical officer said, her voice low. "If they keep going like this, there won't be anything left on that side of the rift." Sarek didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the largest human ship as it turned its massive guns toward the heart of the enemy fleet. No. He realized then that the battle was no longer about survival or defense. The humans were sending a message, one written in fire and wreckage, and the enemy was starting to understand. The battlefield had shifted from chaos to something darker, something that felt almost calculated. The Vrax still fought with numbers, but they were no longer the hunters here. The humans had turned the rift into a killing ground, and every move the enemy made only drew them deeper into the trap. From the bridge of the Vigilant Dawn, Admiral Sarek could feel it. The rhythm of the fight had changed. It was no longer about who had more firepower. It was about who understood the battlefield better, and the humans. They understood it completely. Enemy cruisers tried to regroup along the far edge of the rift, forming a defensive arc to cover their retreat. It should have worked. In most battles, this was the moment when a desperate commander could buy precious minutes and pull their fleet out alive. But the humans didn't attack head-on. They didn't charge that defensive wall. Instead, they began targeting the rift itself. Sarek frowned, leaning forward over the display. "They're firing at debris fields." It made no sense at first. Massive tungsten slugs slammed into drifting rock and ancient wreckage, breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces until the scanner feeds were nothing but static and ghost readings. But then the tactical map began to shift. Debris clouds drifted on gravitational eddies, spreading into the retreat path of the Vrax fleet. First Vrax ships hit the cloud, and that's when Sarek understood. The fragments weren't just random rock. They had been seeded with micromines, cloaked and dormant until something passed too close. A dozen small flashes lit up the map, and enemy ships staggered, their engines crippled before they even realized they'd been trapped. But the humans didn't stop there. Their lead ships dove straight into the debris fields themselves, vanishing from sensors as if swallowed by the rift. For long seconds, there was nothing, just the flicker of dying enemy ships trying to limp away. Then the human fleet reappeared behind them. "They're on the wrong side," the sensor officer said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "They let the enemy think they were retreating, then jumped right through the rift's gravity corridor." Was insane. No sane fleet would risk that maneuver. The rift's gravity corridor was unstable, riddled with unpredictable pulls that could tear a ship apart. But the humans had done it without hesitation, and now they were between the Vrax and their escape route. The Vrax panicked. Their formations shattered, captains shouting over one another in desperate commands. Some tried to break through the human line. Others turned back toward the Allied fleet, hoping to punch through the weaker prey. But the humans had anticipated it all. Missiles streaked out, not warheads this time, but something far stranger. Projectiles burst open, releasing hundreds of metallic spheres that latched onto enemy hulls. Sarek's sensors went wild with false readings as the spheres began broadcasting scrambled signals, feeding the VAX ship's ghost coordinates, fake threats, and phantom fleets that didn't exist. Their comms collapsed under the noise, leaving captains blind and deaf in the middle of the fight. And then came the soundless moment. The part of the battle that made the hair on Sarek's neck stand up. The human fleet stopped firing, not completely occasional. Bursts still cut down stragglers, but the furious constant barrage simply ceased. For a long, breathless minute, all that moved was the slow drift of ships and debris. The Vrax hesitated, confused, unsure whether the Deathworlders were out of ammunition or preparing for something worse. Something worse came. A deep pulse rippled through space, bending sensor readings into jagged noise. The humans had deployed. Something massive, too big to be a mine, too controlled to be random. On the tactical display, Sarek saw the rift itself seem to shimmer, its edges warping unnaturally. The debris clouds the humans had created earlier began to move, accelerating toward the Vrax ships without any visible thrust. Gravity itself was being bent to turn every rock, every scrap of wreckage, into a weapon. The first impacts were catastrophic. A Vrax destroyer was cut in half by a tumbling fragment the size of a shuttle. Another ship simply vanished as a cluster of debris slammed through its midsection at impossible speed. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an avalanche in space. One the Vrax couldn't climb out of. On the Vigilant Dawn, the bridge crew watched in stunned silence. Sarek could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He'd seen wars end in mass. Surrenders, in political negotiation, even in mutual annihilation. But this was something different. The humans weren't just defeating the Vrax, they were dismantling them. Piece by piece, with a precision that felt almost personal. The enemy tried to flee again, breaking in every direction, but the humans had already closed the exits. Smaller Deathworlder ships darted ahead, laying more mines, hurting the survivors exactly where they wanted them. Every move the Vrax made only tightened the noose. Finally, the human flagship lit its forward batteries again.
One by one,
They began targeting the largest remaining ship's command vessels, carrier groups, heavy cruisers, and erasing them from existence. Each strike was clean, final, and without hesitation. There was no gloating, no warning, no demand for surrender. Only the cold execution of a plan that had been unfolding since the first human shots were fired. On the bridge, Sarek finally spoke, his voice low. "They're not fighting for territory. They're fighting for memory." No one replied. All knew what he meant. The Deathworlders weren't here to hold ground or claim victory in the way other fleets did. They were here to make sure that anyone who saw this battle or even heard of it would remember exactly what happened when humans entered a war, and from the way the Vrax fleet was dying, it was working. The rift was no longer a battlefield. It was a hunting ground, and the Vrax were prey that didn't yet realize how little hope they had left. The debris storms the humans had created still spun in violent arcs, tearing through ships with brutal, silent efficiency. The survivors scattered in all directions, but every escape route led to the same place, right into the Deathworlders. Waiting hands. Admiral Sarek stood motionless on the Vigilant Dawn's bridge, his eyes locked on the tactical display. The Allied fleet had pulled back to the edges of the fight, almost forgotten in the chaos. What had begun as a desperate stand had become something else entirely. Now they were witnesses, not participants, as the humans executed a plan so ruthless it made even the battle-hardened veterans uneasy. "Sir," the sensor officer said softly, "the humans are shifting position again." Sarek leaned forward. The Deathworlder fleet wasn't chasing the Vrax directly anymore. Instead, they were moving in long, deliberate arcs, their paths cutting through the rift in wide curves. It took Sarek a moment to see that the arcs weren't random. They were building a wall. They're sealing the rift, Sarek realized. One by one, human warships dropped massive devices into space hulking. Angular constructs that unfolded into wide, shimmering planes of energy. The devices, linked to one another in seconds, forming an expanding lattice of containment fields. The Vrak ships that had been heading for the rift's far exit slammed into the trap, their shields flaring violently as they bounced off walls they hadn't known were there. The trap was more than just a barrier. Tarek saw drones emerging from the lattice edges, darting toward trapped ships like vultures toward a dying animal. Some planted charges, others disabled engines. Every action was cold, methodical, designed not for speed, but for inevitability. The Vrak's commander's voice suddenly broke through on an open channel. His words translated into the Allied language. By the bridge AI, unknown fleet, this is Commander Shirak of the Vrak's Imperial Strike Group. Identify yourselves and state your intentions or face total retaliation. The humans didn't respond. Not a single come signal came from them. The silence stretched across the battlefield like a suffocating weight. The Vraks tried again, their tone harder, more desperate. Do you understand who you are dealing with? We will. The channel cut off mid-sentence. The human flagship had targeted the Vrak's command ship and fired a single shot, one blinding lance of kinetic energy that tore through its core and left nothing but drifting wreckage. Sarek felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen executions before, but never like this. There was no ceremony, no show of power beyond the act itself. The humans simply removed the head of the enemy fleet and continued their work as if nothing had happened. The trap tightened. Lattice walls folded inward, shrinking the kill zone. The remaining Vrak ships, fewer than a quarter of their original number, clustered together in a tight formation, firing wildly at the closing walls. Their blasts fizzled harmlessly against the shimmering energy planes. The humans stayed just out of range, circling like wolves, striking only when a Vrak's vessel strayed too far from the pack. It was then Sarek noticed something unsettling. The humans weren't destroying every ship. Some were left crippled, but intact, drifting helplessly with no power. Their crews would live long enough to watch the rest of their fleet be annihilated. This wasn't just victory. This was a message. The Allied bridge crew shifted uneasily, some glancing at Sarek as if expecting him to order an intervention. He didn't. The truth was, he didn't know if they could intervene, even if they tried. The humans had built this trap for the Vraks, but it could just as easily hold anyone else, including them. The Vraks made one last attempt to break free, a coordinated push from all surviving ships toward a single point in the lattice. It was a desperate move, the kind made when there was nothing left to lose. The humans were ready. From behind the Vraks, hidden by the chaos, 3 massive Deathworlder ships decloaked. They had been waiting there the entire time, engines cold to avoid detection. The moment the Vraks charged, the hidden ships opened fire, shredding the fleeing vessels before they even reached the lattice wall. The few that survived were pushed back into the kill zone, where the waiting human fleet finished them with clinical precision. It was over. The lattice walls began to collapse, folding back into the devices that had created them. The debris storm slowed, the drones retracted, and the battlefield fell into a strange, hollow, quiet day. The humans drifted among the wreckage for several minutes, scanning, verifying. Then, one by one, their ships turned away from the rift. Sarek expected them to approach the Allied fleet, perhaps exchange signals, offer some explanation. Instead, the Deathworlders kept their distance. Their fleet passed along the rift's outer edge without a single transmission, their scarred hulls catching the light of distant stars. The only thing they left behind was a single beacon, floating where the Vrak's fleet had been destroyed. The beacon's signal was weak, but the vigilant Dawn's comms officer patched it through. A simple message appeared on Sarek's display, written in the plain, sharp script of the human language. This war is over for them. It doesn't have to be for you. Sarek stared at it for a long moment, his mind turning over the meaning. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. But it wasn't a promise of alliance either. The humans vanished into the darkness beyond the rift, leaving only silence. In their wake, the rift lay quiet now, silence broken only by the soft hum of damaged engines and the faint crackle of broken transmissions. Where once the Vrax fleet had moved like a tide of blades, there was now only scattered wreckage drifting lifeless. In the cold, the Allied fleet, battered and limping, remained on the far edge of the kill zone, their crews staring out at the void with the stunned disbelief of survivors who didn't yet understand how they'd lived through it. Admiral Sarek stood on the bridge of the vigilant dawn, his gaze fixed on the fading glow of the Death Worlder fleet. For long minutes, the humans had done nothing but sweep the battlefield, scanning, marking, and finishing off any lingering threats. Their silence was unnerving. Even in victory, most fleets spoke, calling out status reports, confirming kills, issuing commands. But the Deathworlders had said nothing. It was as if they were ghosts, operating in some private war that no one else could touch. Then the first signal came through, Admiral. The comms officer said sharply, "We've got an incoming transmission. Narrow band, encrypted. Not in any Allied code." Sarek's pulse quickened. Origin. She hesitated. Human flagship. The bridge fell silent. No one moved. For the first time since the humans had arrived, they were about to speak. The officer worked quickly, running the unfamiliar encryption through the translation matrix. The system lagged, struggling with the strange cadence of human language, till finally the speakers crackled to life. The voice that filled the bridge was deep. It's measured and calm, not the voice of someone who had just destroyed an entire fleet, but of someone stating a fact that could not be challenged. To the Vrax survivors, there will be no negotiations. There will be no terms. You brought war to this place, and you will carry the memory of what happened here until your last breath. This is not mercy. This is the only warning you will ever get. The translation ended, leaving the bridge in a heavy silence. The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that settled in the chest like a stone. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even hatred. It was certainty, the kind that came from a predator, explaining to its prey exactly why it had lived this long. Sarek realized then that the message hadn't been for the Allies at all. It had been for the survivors, those few crippled Vrax ships the humans had deliberately spared. They would crawl home, humiliated, broken, forced to tell their people what they had seen. The humans wanted that story to spread. The Deathworlders were not just fighting a war, they were shaping its legend. "Sir," the tactical officer said quietly, "the humans are transmitting on an open frequency now." Sarek turned back to the main display. The human fleet had shifted into a loose formation, their engines burning brighter as they prepared to leave the rift. Across all channels, their signal came through, this time addressed to anyone who could hear it. "We are the Deathworlders. We do not come to your wars to take sides. We come to end them. If you bring destruction to the innocent, if you threaten what is not yours, we will find you. We will not fight fair. We will not fight clean. We will fight until nothing of you remains." The words rolled through the void, translated into every major galactic tongue. Ships across light years would pick it up, stations would record it, governments would dissect it. Sarek knew this moment would echo in war councils and border negotiations for decades. The voice continued, almost softer now, but sharper somehow. "To the rest of you, remember what you saw here today. Remember it when you make your next choice. That is all." And then, just as suddenly as they had spoken, the humans were silent again. No signatures of further transmissions. No direct contact with the Allied fleet, just the flare of their engines as they accelerated into deep space, vanishing into the black with the same ruthless efficiency they had shown in battle. For a while, no one on the vigilant dawn spoke. The crew went about their duties in near silence, as if speaking too loudly might invite the humans back. Finally, Sarek exhaled, his voice low. "They didn't come to save us." The comms officer glanced at him.
Oh.
"Then why did they come?" Allah, Sarek looked back at the empty space where the human fleet had disappeared. "To make sure the galaxy remembers them." On the far edge of the rift, one of the crippled Vrax ships still drifted, sparks leaking from its damaged hull. Sarek knew what those survivors were feeling. Shame, fear, the weight of a new name etched into their enemy's history. The humans had let them live not out of compassion, but because the story of this defeat would do more damage than any weapon. The war was far from over. But after today, no one would think of it in the same way again. The Clyros Rift was quiet again. But it was not the same silence it had known before. The wreckage of two fleets drifted in the void, a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Pieces of Vrax's warships tumbled slowly, their edges glowing faintly where molten hull had cooled in the vacuum. Even the debris seemed to keep its distance from the faint hum of the single beacon the Deathworlders had left behind, as if the space around it carried a weight that could not be broken. From the bridge of the Vigilant Dawn, Admiral Sarek watched the slow drift of the battlefield. Rescue shuttles from the Allied fleet were already moving among the wreckage, searching for survivors, recovering black boxes, and marking the dead. Yet the crew worked in near silence, voices hushed as if afraid to disturb something still lingering in the air. "They're gone," the sensor officer said quietly, as if speaking the truth aloud might summon them back. No warp signatures. Within range, no trace of their trajectory. Sarek nodded slowly. That's how they wanted it. The humans had left with the same precision they'd shown in battle. No contact, no negotiation, no explanation. They'd simply vanished into the dark, leaving behind only their message and the memory of what they had done. It was not the departure of an ally who had saved Hewitt, was the withdrawal of a force that had finished its work and no longer had reason to stay, as the Allied fleet regrouped. Word of the battle began to spread, ships passing through nearby. Systems picked up fragments of the human broadcast, carrying it farther and farther into the galaxy. The translation "A is on distant worlds" would render the words into countless languages. But Sarek knew the meaning would remain the same. The Deathworlders had returned, and they had chosen the terms of their involvement. On the outer edges of Sarek, the Rift, the crippled Vrax ships, still drifted. Their crews, what remained of them, were silent on all frequencies. They made no calls for reinforcements, no threats of vengeance. It was as if they feared speaking might draw the humans' attention back to them. Sarek could imagine the conversations that would come when they finally limped home, conversations filled with disbelief, shame, and the quiet dread of knowing that somewhere out there, those same ships could return at any time. The beacons. Signal pulsed steadily, easy to find for anyone scanning the region. The message was still the same, cycling in its plain, unadorned text. "Next time, we will not stop here." There was no signature, no emblem, no identification code. It didn't need one. Everyone who saw it would know who had left it. Sarek found himself staring at the message for longer than he intended. There was a strange weight to it, not just a threat, but a promise. The Deathworlders had not claimed the rift. They hadn't demanded territory or spoils. They had simply made sure that every faction, every government, every warlord who heard about Clyros would think twice before deciding what kind of war they wanted to start around him. The bridge crew slowly returned to their routines. Damage. Reports came in. Casualty lists were updated. Fleet repositioning orders were issued. But there was an edge to the air that hadn't been there before. Every officer, every crew member carried the same thought if the humans had wanted to. They could have turned their guns on the Allied fleet just as easily as they had on the Vrax, and there would have been nothing anyone could do to stop them later. In the privacy of his quarters, Sarek replayed the human transmission one last time. He listened not just to the words, but to the tone, the deliberate pace, the way the speaker never raised their voice. That calm was what unsettled him most. It was the calm of someone who had nothing to prove, because they had already shown. The only proof that mattered, reports would come in over the next weeks. Pirates abandoning routes they had claimed for decades. Border skirmishes abruptly called off without explanation. Intelligence intercepts of Vrax's military channels filled with confusion and quiet fear. The galaxy was already changing, reacting to an event that had lasted only hours, but would echo for decades. Sarek knew he would write his own report for the High Command, filled with tactical analysis, sensor logs, and strategic recommendations, but there was one thing he wouldn't write, because he knew no one in the high halls of politics would understand it. The Death Worlders hadn't just won the battle. They had taken control of the story. And in the end, that was what everyone would remember, far out beyond the rift. Somewhere in the cold black between stars, the humans were already gone. But their shadows stretched farther than their ships could fly, and it would linger long after the wreckage here had turned to dust.